Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
I'm Tom, and you should be dancing.
and this is episode number 34.
Today, we are going to take a trip back in time to the magical and mythical place called 1977 in Manhattan. And today, we are talking about the infamous, the famous, the legendary, the one, the only Studio 54.
I'm really excited about this one.
So, Laura, before we get started, how much do you actually know about Studio 54 other than just the name?
What I know of it is that a lot of celebrities and the elite used to party there back in the 70s, and there was a lot of drugs, especially cocaine. So that's what I know.
Throw in Quaaludes and you've pretty much got a big handle of it. A shit ton of Quaaludes. Literal, like, handing it out like Willy Wonka at the Wonka factory. Quaaludes.
I kind of see it in my mind as like equivalent to like late 90s, early 2000s raves and ecstasy, right?
Yes, to an extent. You're gonna see this is extremely hedonistic. I mean, that's the best way I can kind of describe it. It's very excess. It is the height of indulgence in the 70s for kind of the elite and for anyone who was deemed worthy enough to get in on a certain night.
I'm sure you're going to get into this, but was it by invitation only? Did you need to know somebody?
So, pretty much, and I'll get into this more in a minute, but pretty much the criteria to get in was unless you were a celebrity, it was pretty much just whatever the whims of the owners were on that particular night. There was really no rhyme or reason to how people were let in. So the story of Studio 54 really starts with their two main owners. That is two gentlemen named Ian Schrager and Steve Rubel. They both have very typical 1900s Brooklyn upbringings.
I haven't heard of either one of them.
There you go. They both were sons of immigrants from Brooklyn. They grew up in kind of the lower middle class, wanting a better life for themselves. They end up meeting in Syracuse University in college, and they become very good friends. In part because they are very much the yin to each other's yang. Ian is kind of a behind the scenes business master. He ends up going to law school and becoming a lawyer. Steve is the social butterfly. He is very out there. He is the life of the party. Studio 54 becomes a way to really express his sexuality as a gay man. Meanwhile, Ian is basically behind the scenes making all the deals. So they get into business together when Steve had started steak restaurants out of college and was basically going bankrupt. So Ian helps him fight off the creditors and declare bankruptcy.
Did he own a Sizzler?
It was not a Sizzler. It was, I think it was like the Steak Rub or something. Basically, it is the brash audaciousness of a kid out of college owning a bunch of steak restaurant chains. So first, they start a catering hall slash club in Queens called Enchanted Gardens, and this is very much kind of the suburban, very flashy banquet hall. You know, they do parties and bar mitzvahs and all of those type of deals. But their dream is to open up a nightclub in Manhattan. That's their dream. And they get an opportunity to open a nightclub on a abandoned theater on the corner of 8th and 54th Street in the west side of Manhattan. Now, at this time, the west side of Manhattan is not what the west side of Manhattan is now.
I was going to ask if you knew what the neighborhood was like back then.
This was before Broadway, and one of the main sources for this is the Netflix documentary on this. The word they used was It was before it was Disneyfied. So this is when Broadway was still very dirty and gritty and had theaters next to, peep shows and things like that. And it was not a safe place. It was, you would use whatever, unfortunately, whatever coded language you want to use, but it was not a safe neighborhood. And these guys wanted to change that. They wanted to make it a destination. And so they buy this theater on 8th and 54th. Now, the theater itself, when they buy it, it's a theater. It's an old opera house with a balcony and a sloped floor for the main seating. It was built in the 1920s as an opera house, and then it was in the 1950s it became a CBS television studio. And they shot a lot of game shows and live action television in this theater, including Captain Kangaroo was one of the shows they actually shot at this theater. But it had been abandoned since 1975 when they moved all their production out to California. So they buy the theater in 1976, and within about 6 to 8 weeks, they convert it into a club. Now, there was a lot of work that had to be done. So they worked round the clock. They did not get building permits. And one of the overarching themes, is that they cut a lot of corners. But one of the things they did was they took out the slanted floor where the main seating was for the theater, and they had it just flat with tables and room for a dance floor. They left the balcony with the seating there, and then they had a stage. And they did something that not a lot of other clubs had done at the time. They had Tony Award winning lighting designers design the lights and the dance floor almost like a stage. And we'll put these pictures up on our socials and with the YouTube video. But there were lights that moved up and down. There were dance platforms that moved up and down. There was a stage with a signature starburst behind it, along with a infamous moon man in the shape of a moon snorting cocaine out of a spoon.
So there's the first reference of the cocaine.
In case you had any misconceptions about what kind of a club this was going to be.
So this sounds very unique and very customized.
It's very unique. It's very customized. It only took them 6 weeks to build. They were rushing people in and out to get it done.
When you said that, I thought that it was a really short time because I'm like, okay, do they just need to put up walls, like, and level out the floor? But like, 6 weeks is not a lot of time. Especially, I'm assuming this was a big place, right? So
It's a regular size theater, and to do what they wanted to do with the dance floor, you could not have a slanted floor like a movie theater or a playhouse would have. So they basically rip out the floor, put a flat floor in, so they can do the dance floor. And then they were going to have the balcony on top, leave it as is, so that people could essentially sit up there and watch the dancing or watch the performances, because there were also performers while there was dancing. Now, as we later found out, it eventually became a literal sex grotto, as you can imagine.
essentially the Playboy Mansion on the East Coast.
Well, let's put it this way. I was going to get into this later, but I might as well get into it now. About 2 years into the club, they had to put rubber on top of everything in the balcony because it was easier to hose down.
That's gross.
I'll leave it to your own conclusions what they were hosing down. But they get the club done, and it opens on April 26th, 1977, to great fanfare. This was really a very kind of grassroots marketing campaign by Steve and Ian. Really, Ian. Ian had worked behind the scenes to get a lot of celebrities in the door the first night. He actually had hired someone whose job it was to get celebrities there. They would get bonuses whenever the tabloid would take pictures of them leaving the club. Specifically, the two tabloid papers in New York, the Post and the Daily News. So if she got a celebrity there and their picture was on the front page of the Daily News or the Post, she would get an extra $100. That's what she reported in the documentary.
Well, I mean, that's just excellent advertising.
And if the celebrity was written about in page 6, which was the famous celebrity gossip column of the Post, that was an extra $50. So there was very much a concerted effort from day one, from before day one, that the only way this was going to work was having celebrities in the door and having this be a place to be in New York.
Can I just say too that it feels very New York doing that?
This could not work anywhere else but Hollywood.
Yes, agreed.
That's the only other place where they could have done this the way they did it. And they also managed to get a lot of press. They had TV come out and do reports about it on the news. They had the New York Times write pieces about it, the Daily News, the Post. I mean, this was a full-on grassroots media blitz, the same way you would see clubs or movies use social media now to try and gin up interest in this thing. So when they decide also to make the nightclub, they decide they're going to model it after some of the more well-known gay bars in New York. And the reason why they chose disco music was one, disco music had become very popular in the late 70s. That's like 1977 and 1980 is really kind of the heyday for disco music. And while disco music was really an African American, a black music style, it had become popularized through the white gay clubs. And the documentary goes into pretty good detail about how the white gay clubs in New York kind of became this melting pot for everybody. Because what would happen is straight women would go to the gay clubs to go and dance without being hassled. And then straight men would go to the gay clubs to try and pick up the straight women. People would get lost in the music and would just start dance, and everyone would be dancing with each other. And of course, there was a lot of drugs.
A lot of drugs.
But this is kind of the open atmosphere and accepting atmosphere that they wanted to create. They wanted it to rival that energy that once you got in, it was a safe place where everyone can kind of be themselves. And they were. And in fact, the documentary goes into pretty great detail about how it was a place where the LGBTQ community, where transgender individuals could dance and feel safe. There was an interview with a transgender pair that said this was the only place in New York they felt accepted. And it was very much a party atmosphere. And it's with this party atmosphere that they opened their doors in April of 1977 to tremendous fanfare. They had expected about, I think, 1,000 to 2,000 people that night. When they opened the doors, there was about 4 to 5,000 outside.
Does it make me like a huge nerd or maybe just showing my anxiety? Where when you say that, my immediate thought was, well, what is the capacity in the building?
The
Like,
capacity was about 25,000, 2,500.
okay, so this was over that.
So this was over that. And basically, Steve, who's the very extroverted owner, just takes one of his security guys, makes him the doorman, and he's literally just picking random people out of the crowd to let in and turning them away. And so it's already a massive success before they even open the doors. So you would go inside these blacked out theater doors. You would walk down this ornate golden hall with red carpet. Kind of imagine what an old timey movie theater or playhouse would be with like the gold leaf walls, the Asian red carpet with the gold. You would walk through, and then you would walk through these golden doors that were supposed that you used to lead out to the theater, and then they would walk into this big air space underneath the balcony with tables, and then past the tables would be the dance floor and the stage. So it's a very it feels like you're walking through a red carpet event as you're walking into the dance floor, and it becomes symbolic of what Studio 54 would be about. One columnist described it as it was hell outside, but it was paradise inside. Because one of the defining factors of Studio 54 is that no one really knew what the criteria were for entry. There was a cover charge, but basically the criteria for entry was whatever Steve felt like the criteria was on a given night.
I was just gonna say that doesn't seem fair, and I'm sure that drove some people crazy because they didn't know what to do to make sure they got in.
Well, and it became people then would basically were sent into a frenzy to try and get in. And in fact, I'm going to read you something here from the New York Times from the opening night. The result was that from that West 54th Street, where several dozen patrons were blocking off half the street, the theater appeared to be packed to its 2,500 seat capacity. Inside, where Mr. Rubel was pointing out yet another combination of mirrored strobe lights, there were no more than a few hundred viewers to appreciate them. I think we have a winner, he said. So it was both desired and yet at the same time very exclusive. And that made it an immediate hit.
That's a winning combination.
People were dying to get into Studio 54. Within weeks, it becomes the it place, and all sorts of celebrities are flocking there to hang out, to dance, and to party. Alec Baldwin is a waiter there for a while. Andy Warhol is a regular. Truman Capote is a regular. Liza Minnelli is a regular. Michael Jackson is a regular. Bianca Jagger famously rides into the dance floor and the stage on a white horse.
I feel like I've heard that story. Yeah.
Justin Trudeau's mother, the first lady to the Prime Minister of Canada, was famously photographed without underwear at Studio 54. The other thing that made it exclusive too were photographers were almost pretty much barred from the club. The only photographers that were let in were photographers from like the Daily News or the Post because the club owners wanted the celebrities to be photographed inside the club. But before long, it becomes a literal playpen for the celebrities and the elite of New York. It became a playhouse for the New York elite where they can dance the night away and have whatever fun they wanted, dancing or otherwise. There were allegedly sex rooms in the basement. The balcony basically was a place where you could do things or have things done to you if you wanted. And there were quaaludes and cocaine and whatever party drug you wanted readily available. In fact, the story went that Steve was giving out drugs essentially.
And it sounds like it was a good place for these celebrities to have some, like you said, freedom, kind of anonymity where they could do what they wanted and then it wasn't necessarily leaked to the press or, you know what I mean? So I think that was a huge selling point for them too.
It was, and the pictures that would come out of there were the pictures that they wanted to come out of there. Now, of course, pictures were taken anyway, and you can go online and you can see celebrities and people in various states of dress or undress or wearing whatever thing they could come up with, on the dance floor or on the couches. And Steve was right there in the middle of it, partying every night. But it very much became this kind of indulgent paradise for anyone who could get in. The club was open from 10 to 6 every night, or Tuesday to Saturday. Eventually, they would open on Sunday. And it was so popular that they were raking in money hand over fist. The club is a tremendous success, and Steve becomes the public face of it. He does all the press. He is always interviewed. He is always photographed. He gives an infamous interview to Dan Dorfman, the business columnist at New York Magazine. And a couple of the quotes he would say would eventually come back to haunt him. So he tells Dorfman, the profits are astronomical, Rubel boasted. Only the mafia does better. The piece later goes on to say he was quote unquote skittish about talking figures. It's a cash business and you have to worry about the IRS, he pleaded. I don't want them to know everything.
I mean, this already sounds like it's not going down a good road.
So, very early on, to that end, some of the employees at Studio 54 report that they were basically 2 sets of register tape because you would have to pay like an $8 or $9 cover charge to get in. There would be 1 set of register tape from like 10 to midnight, and then there would be a second set of register tape from midnight on. The legend then becomes the first set of tape was what they reported as income. Second was not. And so you can already kind of start to see where this is going a little bit here.
Because you said their hours were 10 to 6.
Yeah.
So they're only getting, what, a quarter of their revenue recorded?
Yes. But they were
That's,
doing so well that a quarter was still fantastic. They're paying cash to get in the door.
they may have still been doing well with that quarter of the revenue, but that's still three quarters that are unreported and is a huge issue. So I know you're going to get into it.
It's also, they're doing this without a liquor license. They had applied for a liquor license from New York State, but they were not able to get it in time for the opening. So what they did, and this is kind of, I guess you would call creative lawyering, is they applied for catering permits every night. And the studio was actually based under a catering company called the Broadway Catering Corp.
Was that a legal way to get around this?
It was a loophole
Okay.
because by applying for a catering permit, they didn't have a permanent license, but at least for that one night, they could serve liquor. About a year after the club opens, the State Liquor Board of New York gets wise and they stop issuing the catering permits. And then Studio 54 gets raided for the first time, this time by the State Liquor Board.
When was this? How far into its life was this?
This was late 1978.
Okay, so like a year and a half later,
Year
almost
and a
two
half,
years.
about a year and a half into the club opening.
Okay.
By this point, the club is legend. I should also mention too by this point that it's become so popular that people are literally dying to get in. There's a famous story that Liza Minnelli confirms that a guy tried to crawl into the club through the air conditioning vent and died in the vent.
It's not that serious, dude. Like, that's a little nuts.
That was indicative of how completely random basically entry was to the club. Celebrities were usually rubber stamped in, comped, and everything was taken care of. The owners understood that celebrities were driving this thing and that people wanted to go to the club because there were celebrities there. So they understood that they had to keep the celebrities coming back every night. There was a list of celebrities that were automatic entries no matter what, and they were always taken care of. And that included Andy Warhol, Truman Capote, people like that.
It's interesting you say that because it reminds me a bit of the Playboy clubs where there was this like A list and they were always admitted and sat in these VIP sections and always taken care of and given like the best girls to wait on them and stuff. So it's very similar to that. I'm seeing a lot of like parallels.
Well, and also too, like think of like the Rat Pack in the 50s in Vegas. It's that type of status, just with a dance floor and disco and a mood man snorting plastic cocaine from a spoon.
Now, you may not know this, but I'm wondering if the owners, because this is, like you said, 2 years into it, I'm wondering if the owners ever considered opening another Studio 54 in another city. Like, do you know? Did they talk about that at all?
That was never thought of.
Okay.
Now, eventually, and I'll get to this later, they ended up opening up other clubs, but they never thought about, or I never read anything about branching out or licensing the Studio 54 name. That was their baby. And again, Ian was the one in the back basically making all the deals to keep this going. Steve was the one that was out partying every night. And he's doing every interview and he's doing every TV interview. He's the one being photographed and everything. So we fast forward back to 1978. The liquor license gets challenged all the way up to the state Supreme Court in New York, which then overturns the liquor board's decision to not grant the liquor license, which actually then leads to the liquor board publicly slamming the judge, claiming that he was being influenced by the celebrities that were going into Studio 54.
I could see that though, you know?
Again, they were very powerful. They were very, very powerful. Their lawyer was Roy Cohn, the mob lawyer.
And who's to say this judge didn't go to Studio 54 himself?
We'll see. We're gonna get to that.
Okay. Did
Not
I?
with the judge specifically, but
Oh,
we're gonna get to that
I thought I accidentally tripped into something, but okay.
again. But it was a lot of very powerful people went to Studio 54, and so the club continues on, and the party keeps going until December of 1979, and that's when those three scary letters get tipped off about the club: IRS. In December of 1979, the IRS raids Studio 54 in the morning. The manager of the club tells a story that allegedly there were secret books kept in the basement of the club, along with bags of cocaine, allegedly. As the story goes, or as he tells it to the documentary, the manager was in the club that day trying to get the books out before the IRS can find them. But as he's coming up the elevator, he runs into the agents who then tell him to go down to the basement. And that's where they find the second set of books. These books are extremely detailed. They have the amounts they took in every night, the profits, the deficits, and there's a column way at the very end of their books that says skim. They were recording how much they were skimming off of the profits every night in writing.
Well, that's just stupid.
Allegedly, it's while this is all going on, Ian shows up to the studio to work, where he drops his papers, and in his papers, allegedly, were 5 ounces of cocaine. And so the two owners are indicted for tax evasion and for cocaine possession. And this makes national news. It becomes a huge, huge, huge story. They get 37 lawyers. They had 37 lawyers representing them in this criminal trial.
That's gonna be like some kind of record.
I mean that's a football team. While this is all going on, the club is still open. There's still celebrities and parties and everything going on every night, and Steve is still partying. And they're just kind of going on as if nothing's happening. Again, now you ever have to remember they're like in their 30s, mid 30s at this point. They feel like they're invincible. Ian even talks about this in the documentary. We're going to talk our way out of it the way we talked our way out of everything. It's at this point where Steve and his lawyer team makes a very fatal error. They try to get the federal government off of their case. Are you ready for this?
Probably not.
By having Steve publicly allege that Jimmy Carter's chief of staff was buying and using cocaine inside Studio 54. That he was one of the people that was buying and looking for and using cocaine inside the club.
So was it kind of like a blackmail situation?
I mean, no one's ever really been able to prove that that actually happened. So it almost kind of became like a blackmail.
Yeah.
So they decided they were going to try and blackmail the federal government into getting them out of these charges.
I'm assuming that it didn't work, and you're probably going to tell me in a second. But I just want to say, too, this is pretty open and shut. I mean, the fact that they had a column in the second set of books that said skim, and they found a shitload of cocaine. Like, how do you get around that?
Well, and the cocaine was kind of that became kind of the side story because eventually it was determined they only found 2 ounces of cocaine.
Only 2 ounces of
Only 2 ounces.
cocaine.
Really, the bigger issue was the tax evasion and the skimming of the profits. And eventually, they're convicted. They're convicted and they go to jail on tax evasion charges. Even the night before, I mean, and this is something right out of like a mob movie. The night before they surrender themselves to go to jail, they have another massive party at Studio 54 where Diana Ross sings Steve a version of I Frank Sinatra's I Did It My Way. Like the absolute tone deafness of it and the defiance right till the very end, thinking like this was a game.
I mean, they had to have a goodbye party. I mean, kind of get it. How long did they serve in prison? What was their sentence?
Their sentence was originally 3 years and plus $20,000 in fines each.
Doesn't seem like a lot.
Well, eventually they end up turning state's evidence in prison against other club owners.
Oh,
So they end up getting their sentences reduced to about a year and a half.
that's nothing.
Steve talks very candidly about how they did that because they knew they could not survive in jail. They were not going to last in jail. And their lives, their freedom had just completely vanished. That's a big culture shock for somebody to know you're now confined to this little box for however many years you're or however long you're in prison. That's a big shock to the system, and no one really adjusts to it. As the time goes on, two things happen that are very, very significant in terms of Studio 54. One is that the disco era very much comes to an abrupt halt. Once 1980 hits, that's kind of it. And disco goes from being the hip fab thing to a running joke. There's the line in the movie Airplane about the plane crashing through the the radio tower that's playing all disco. By the mid 80s, there's the Chicago White Sox are holding a disco demolition night where people are blowing up disco records on the field, which turn into a riot.
I've
And I
heard of
can
that. Yeah.
and I can do a whole episode about that too. So that changes. The other thing that changes is the country's going through a recession, and a certain actor from California becomes president in 1980. And so the feelings of people around the country about disco clubs like Studio 54 change as this kind of ultra Christian movement kind of takes hold over the United States. Studio 54 is kind of very much seen by most of America as a house of decadence. One of the interviewers and interviewees in the documentary talks about how to some random person from the Midwest, all of a sudden it was the black man, the gay man, the woman dancing at the club was the reason why they don't have jobs anymore.
The ridiculousness of that.
I'm not saying it's not ridiculous. By bringing it up, he knows that it's ridiculous. It's just that was the reality for a lot of people when what's his name won in a landslide.
It's interesting that the culture changed that quickly from being a lot more open and obviously not great for transgender and gay people back then. They couldn't be as open as they are today, but it's so interesting that it changed from being a little more inclusive behind closed doors to this like huge swing the other way where, it's this is terrible, this is evil, this is, whatever.
And it happened so quickly too.
Yeah.
The same way that disco just went down the tubes, it happened very quickly.
I do have a question. Was Studio 54 still open while they were in prison? Like, was somebody else running it while they were in prison?
Yes, they were still open,
Okay.
but what happened was obviously without Steve there, it kind of lost a little bit of the luster. Also, under New York state law, convicted felons cannot have liquor licenses. And so, because Ian and Steve were now at this point convicted felons, the state revoked their liquor license, and there was no way they could get it back. And so, what ends up happening is in 1981, while Ian's in prison, he negotiates a deal for him and Steve and their silent partner to sell Studio 54.
So they kind of saw the writing on the wall and seeing their dream dying right there. But it was their own damn fault. If they would have run this business a little more on the up and up, Like, I mean, the drugs is one thing, kind of like what you said, drugs were everywhere in the 70s, but I mean, they did this themselves, you know?
They did it by themselves, kind of through their arrogance. Arrogant that they were not going to get caught. It was the arrogance to level a floor without getting a building permit. It was an arrogance to try and sell liquor under a catering license. It was arrogance that they were never going to get caught and they can just, skim whatever profits they wanted off the top because they wanted badly to be rich. It was arrogance that they were never going to get caught and they were going to be able to talk and kind of negotiate themselves out of every situation. And in about a year and a half, their arrogance very much caught up to them. So they sell Studio 54 while they're in jail. The club hangs on for a couple more years, but it's obviously nowhere near what it used to be. And the celebrities don't come back, the fame doesn't come back, and it just becomes just another club. And eventually, the new owners decide to shut it down and rebrand it. Now, the club would go under a couple other different things. They tried to rebrand it as like a rock club, similar to like what CBGB's was in Manhattan. That was the club that launched like the Ramones and really launched the punk rock movement. They tried to make it a rock club. It didn't really take. They tried to make it a supper club. That didn't really take. The last I heard, I think like in 2017, 2018, it actually been reverted back to a playhouse. And there was actually an off-Broadway play there. But Studio 54, as people knew it, only lasted about less than 3 years, 33 months.
When you mentioned that to me when we were talking about doing this episode, I obviously wasn't alive, but it just seems from the video footage and all the press about it and things you can see about it now that it lasted a lot longer than that. That surprised me.
Well, I think it also speaks to how much the reputation precedes it. The reputation, the lore of it lasted a lot longer than the actual club did. It went on for about another 3, 4 years under that moniker before it got rebranded. I think it was recalled the Roxy. I think that was the name of it when it became a rock club. I mean, obviously by that point, Studio 54 had by the early 80s was done. And when you think of Studio 54, that you don't think of the mid to late 80s. You think of the 1977 when it opens to 1980 when Steve and Ian go to jail. That's what you think of as Studio 54. And again, it's not that long. And you think about all the reputation, the lore of it, whether you've seen the Studio 54, there was a movie, I think, called 54 that came out in the 90s. Of course, there was like the infamous Dave Chappelle episode with Charlie Murphy and Rick James at Studio 54. But like the lore of this place outlived the actual place. Think about whatever iconic places that we have, whether it's Disney World, and I'm not comparing, but like Disney World or whatever landmark you want, they don't only last 3 years and they don't kind of make the cultural impact that they do, that Studio 54 did in such a short period of time. Like remember when we were kids and Beanie Babies were a thing? And for the longest time, Beanie Babies were, I mean, there was a Beanie Baby black market and then it just disappeared. I remember what it was like when Pokemon first came out, but even before the video games or the TV show or anything, but it was just the cards and people were going crazy for the cards. Or like when you have a one hit wonder type of song, like the Macarena. And it kind of feels like that, but it's much different, if that makes any sense.
How do you think it's different?
Because it lasted, because people still talk about it. Those things were very, very hot for a hot second. And then once they faded away, that was it.
But I think too, it's become so synonymous with the 70s and with celebrities that I don't think it would have been what it was if it wasn't geared toward the celebrities. I think they really made it.
They did. Celebrities and disco music made it. And because disco music died as quickly and as completely as it did, That as much led to the death of Studio 54 as Steve and Ian going to jail was. Because that was another thing, disco music that had a moment, and then once the moment ended, that was it. And then we had moved on to the 80s to punk rock and to kind of synthesizer pop and eventually then into hip hop and R&B and things like that, but it was a very specific club for a very specific time.
And it does have this like legend to it and this mythology to it that I think helps make it live on.
It was a club unlike anyone else. I mean, what other club at that time would have Tony Award winning lighting designers designing a stage? They had weather machines inside the club so that they could change the weather inside the club. Raining and windy and tornadoes and hurricanes and fog.
That's pretty cool. I would have liked that.
I mean, listen, I'm not going to say anything. They had elevated platforms that would move up and down with lights that would move up and down. That's pretty cool.
That doesn't impress me as much as the weather.
Well, that was, I mean, you have to remember too, that was pretty significant tech mechanically for 1977. They built something in their vision that was iconic. Now, about Steve and Ian themselves, when they get out of jail, they actually open up another club that becomes wildly successful called Palladium in New York City. It's not as decadent as Studio 54, but it is that same type of dance club, and it again is wildly successful. It's not too long after that, unfortunately, that Steve finds out he's diagnosed with AIDS, and he passes away soon after. And that's unfortunately that's a really sad part of this story. In the same way that everyone talks about the club really helping him come to terms and really be open with his sexuality, he unfortunately suffers the same fate that a lot of gay men did in the 80s, which was succumb to AIDS. And Ian talks about how that was very, very hard for him. They had spent, even in jail, they went to the same jail. They were housed in the same jail. Ian had talked a lot in the documentary about Steve kind of being his work wife, for lack of a better term, and how they had saw each other every day. A lot of times, they saw each other more than their own families. Ian talks about how Steve was the extrovert to his very introvert, and they kind of just fit together. Now, Ian has gone on, Ian is still alive, and he has gone on to open a lot of very popular and very successful boutique hotels. And he continues to be very successful, or he was as of 2018, 2019. He actually gets pardoned by President Obama. He has his sentence pardoned, and the explanation was he was young and he made a mistake, which
I don't love that.
no, no, I don't love that either.
And there are so many other people that are more deserving of presidential pardons than somebody like that.
Yeah, that's white privilege.
Again, at what point was he like, hey, this is fine. Let me do this with all my ample time? Like, Jesus Christ.
What I keep coming back to, they literally recorded what they were skimming in their books that Steve's own mother kept.
Like, we talk with a lot of these like corporate crimes and stuff, and even like the tragedies that I cover, like, there's always some ego and hubris behind this, and it just completely falls apart and affects other people. I mean, in this case, people just couldn't come back to a club that they loved, so that's not really a loss too much. But my point is, I feel like with these people, their downfall is their own making, and it's like, I don't feel bad for you. Like, you had an opportunity to do things the right way and you chose not to do that. So this is the consequence.
I mean, I feel bad the guy died of AIDS, but
Yeah, but that had nothing to do with the Studio 54.
what kind of hubris and kind of balls does it take to literally tell a reporter on the record, I don't want the IRS finding out about this? The idea that the IRS raided Studio 54 based on that article, or seeing that article and seeing that quote of "Don't tell the IRS that we're making this much money." That it turned out to be an urban legend. It was an ex-employee who had been fired unceremoniously and who was essentially pissed at Steve and Ian, who goes to the IRS and tells them they got hidden books and cocaine in the basement walls. That's how that happened. It wasn't the IRS saw that and said, "Okay, well, watch this." Again, I go back to the egomania of acting as brash as they did, saying that in an interview, having a lavish going away party when you're going to jail. That's literally what happens in Goodfellas when Henry Hill is doing shots before the limo takes him to jail. Like, that is pretty brash stuff. I'll be honest, when I saw the thing about the pardon, it made me a little angry. You're right, there are a lot of other people who are way more deserving of pardons than a kid who was selfish. I don't really necessarily think they should be able to get it just waved away because, well, quote unquote, they didn't realize how deep they were in. If you're old enough to own something, to own a business, I think you're aware of what's right and what's wrong.
And they weren't in their early 20s. Like they weren't 21, 22, 23. They were in their mid 30s, you said? So I think by that point, we're in our mid 30s. I'm a little older than you. And that's ridiculous. Like I wouldn't even think about doing that. You know what I mean? It's just that excuse of they were young and stupid. I don't buy it.
No, they were greedy and they wanted to be rich and they wanted to do it by any means necessary. And when you play like that, it's fuck around and find out. And if you're going to play that game, well, then you got to be willing to pay the price. Now, to Steve's credit and Ian's credit, they came out of jail. I think it humbled them quite a bit. And, or at least it sounded like it humbled Steve for quite a bit at the end of his life. And they were both very successful. And there is something to be said for building yourself back up from nothing. But at the same time, you don't get all the credit for building yourself back up from nothing when your arrogance was the reason why you had nothing in the first place.
And I do respect that a lot. I think that does take a lot of humility and a lot of effort to get back up to a point where you are successful after that. But I don't feel bad that they got themselves in the position that they did.
And neither do I. I don't necessarily think them not going to jail would have changed anything about Studio 54 because there were a lot of factors that brought its end outside of just them evading taxes and skimming profits. We talked about the changes in kind of American culture and the changing in American music tastes on top of it.
I was going to ask you, do you think that if disco continued to be a popular thing well into the 80s, do you think once these two got out of jail that they would have been able to continue running Studio 54 as it was before they went in?
They probably would have, but the sound of the 80s was so much different than disco. You think of the 80s, it's the high, the very tall hair, it's the hot color windbreakers, it's the synthesizers. Like, I was thinking about this last night when they showed there was a clip. I guess it was like 80s night at the Phillies game last night, and they did a clip of Brandon Marsh and the Fanatic in the Aha Take On Me video where they're sketched in pencil.
I saw that. That was really cool.
That was not something you could have thought of in 1978. Whenever you saw the music videos for disco, it wasn't really videos, it was just recordings of live performances.
Or just footage of people dancing.
Yeah. Maybe the most effects you would have watching a performance was like the star wipe transition to another camera shot, or everyone looked like John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. And that was the other thing too, was that Studio 54 kind of personified that gritty, grimy portrayal of New York, of what New York was in the 70s and the 80s, that dirty, gritty, grimy type of city. And then you had this huge culture shock, and New York became the city of Gordon Gekko and Wall Street and yuppie capitalism. And so they were not going to go dance at Studio 54. they were going to get hammered at a local bar. So there were elements out of their control that changed around them. Now, these two guys, I think, were extremely smart and they were extremely shrewd club owners that knew how to market. And so I think, had they been around, they probably would have known how to pivot to more of an 80s sound and still keep it going. That's one of the great unknowns, is how much longer it would have lasted the way it was had they not gone to jail, or had disco been popular even for like another year or two after that, because it all just ended so abruptly. And that's part of the mythology, is that we'll never really know what else it could have been. So tell us what you think. Tell us what you think about Studio 54. Tell us what you know about Studio 54. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, until I started researching this, we only kind of knew that it was there. I didn't know anything about the history of it until we researched it. So we'd like to know what you think. What do you think about it? What do you think about the owners? What do you think about the club? What do what did you know about it before you listened to us, or before you looked into it yourself? As always, let us know. You can always hit us up at the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com, or at Tell Me About Podcast on TikTok and Instagram. Let us know what you think. We want to hear from you.
So we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode that I'm sure you guys are going to love.
Have a great couple of weeks, everybody.
Bye.